After the controversy and legal challenges of the last two presidential contests, the US electoral system is about to be tested yet again. But with record numbers expected to vote and many states using new technology, experts are already warning of problems on Election Day. So what could go wrong this time? And will the result be clean and fair? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, if the last two US presidential races are anything to go by, this year's race could be as controversial, with voter irregularities and the customary legal wrangling. The experts say the huge voter turnout expected on Election Day could overwhelm the new electronic voting system, prompting a similar debacle to those seen in 2000 and 2004. So, is history about to be repeated, or will the US voting system hold up? Michelle Henry went to find out.
In Tallahassee, Florida's state capital, the pace of life is slow. It seems like the sort of place where not much happens. But it was here in the Bush-Gore election of 2000 that the decision of a single state official decided the fate of millions. Americans are fiercely protective of their rights. The right to bear arms, freedom of religion, freedom of the press are all enshrined in the Constitution. But one peculiar omission is the right to vote, leaving it up to individual states to decide who votes and how. The impact of this omission was to have dramatic consequences. Florida was then, as now, a swing state, which George W. Bush carried by a mere 537 votes. The punch card ballot system then in place had led to thousands of disputed ballots, the now infamous hanging chads. The Democrats requested a manual recount, but the Republican Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, halted it.
I hereby declare Governor George W. Bush the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes.
The majority Republican-appointed Supreme Court supported her decision, saying that as there was no federal right to vote, it was up to Florida to decide.
Unfortunately, the dirty little secret is America has always had partisan elections. Partisan manipulation of the political process has been with us from the very beginning.
Ian Sancho was the official due to lead the recount in 2000. 8 years later, he's in charge of overseeing the elections in Tallahassee and argues that the system is still dangerously flawed.
The United States Constitution is silent about the conduct of its election, which means that every state is free to set up its own paradigm for how votes are going to be counted. And unfortunately, too many of these states have established parochial, political procedures which are designed to help those who control a majority of the legislature.
Under the U.S. system, each state has a number of electoral votes depending on its size. The majority of states vote either overwhelmingly Republican or Democrat, so it is the so-called swing states that decide an election. This explains the ferocity of the competition in these states. Republicans accuse Democrats of trying to register illegal voters, and Democrats accuse Republicans of trying to exclude their supporters on technicalities. In an attempt to avoid the problems of 2000, early voting has already begun, and lawyers have been provided to resolve disputes on the spot. The sheer volume of voter turnout is already creating problems. Long lines and failing machines have been reported, and some remain nervous about the system.
I'm from South Florida, and I saw what happened in the 2000 election, and I just want my vote to count, and I'm scared to death. If I vote early, something may happen to my vote.
Florida is now in the midst of a historic election, as you all know.
In Florida, the Secretary of State is once again a Republican, but is insistent that the approach to the election is nonpartisan, and Florida is getting it right this time.
How do you respond to accusations that the voter laws favor Republicans over Democrats?
It's all proportional to the numbers of voter registration applications that they're submitting. I mean, the Democrats submitted almost 500,000 voter registration applications. The Republicans had only submitted somewhere less than 250,000. Certainly this law is not intended to snare any particular group or party.
Everything's ready.
Florida has some of the most stringent voter registration laws in the U.S. Much has been made of the no match, no vote rule, where your current details must exactly match the information the state holds in order for you to register to vote.
There's no evidence that any of these people, when the numbers are now in the 10,000 range, are anything but legal voters. And the idea that, and I've heard this argument advanced by the Secretary of State's office, It's just a few thousand. Excuse me. One disenfranchisement is one disenfranchisement too much, in my opinion.
Despite these misgivings, many in Florida are convinced that the country has moved on from 2000.
I think that the country is going in a great new direction, and I just voted for it.
The United States has come under recent criticism for exporting a failed financial doctrine to the world, at a time when the U.S. is engaged in 2 wars with the stated aim of exporting its version of democracy. Perhaps this election can show that American democracy is something worth fighting for.
Michelle Henry for Inside Story, Washington, D.C.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Denver. Robert Hardaway, he's a professor of law at the Sturm College of Law. In West Palm Beach, Kevin Lanning, he's a voting rights activist and associate professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University. And in New York, Larry Norden, he's the director of the Voting Technology Assessment Project at New York University's Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Kevin Lanning in West Palm Beach, Florida. Let me start with you, if I may. I mean, Florida, again, is a key swing state. You were in Florida in 2000 when all the controversy and confusion happened during that presidential race. How worried are you about Florida this time round?
Well, one way of thinking about elections is that an election is a measure of the popular will. Our election system is not a particularly good measure, not a particularly fine measure. It's kind of like a rubber yardstick. In 2000, we needed a micrometer to figure out what the national will was, and we didn't have one. This year, I don't think we need the micrometer to figure out what people want. I'm not that concerned this year, frankly.
OK, well, let's put that question to Robert Hardaway in Denver, Colorado. The last 2 presidential races were shrouded in controversy. I mean, could we see a repeat of that? And what do you think could go wrong this time round?
Well, really, the only thing that could go wrong is if it's a close election. If it's not close, then most of these problems become irrelevant. So I don't see any problems as long as the election is not close. The problem will come if it is indeed close. Then you scrutinize every aspect of the election like you did in the year 2000. One of the advantages of the Electoral College is that if the election is close, generally the recounts are limited to one state, like in Florida. If we had a popular vote election like in 1960, if we'd had a popular vote election in 1960, we probably wouldn't know to this day who won the election, because you'd have to have recounts in over 62,000 hamlets in all 50 states, multiplying the trauma of Florida in 2000 by a factor of 50. So we've been very lucky.
Let's bring in Larry Norden in New York. I mean, you co-authored a report that assesses the ability across 50 states to address problems on Election Day. How worried are you by your findings?
Well, I do agree with the previous 2 comments. All of this comes into play much more if there are close elections. And, you know, the presidential election may or may not be close. Time will tell. There are likely to be some close races in some places for members of Congress, for members of the Senate. And that's where these things can make a difference. And some of the things that we talked about in our report are things like the failure of voting machines during the election, creating long lines in polling places. This is something we've seen in the past. Failure to aggregate totals from what we call different precincts where people are voting at the county level. These have been problems in the past. I'd say one advantage that we have at this point is that election officials have become a lot more familiar with these machines. When we were dealing with them in 2004, there was a very large percentage of the country that was using these machines for the first time. We're now at a point where we have a lot more experience, so we have a sense of what can go wrong, and that certainly helps election officials prepare for those kinds of problems.
Kevin Lanning in Florida, let's bring you back in here, because Larry Norden seems to be saying that perhaps US states are better prepared this time round. But do you think there's enough redundancy in the system if the new technology fails?
Frankly, I'm not sure. Again, I would point to the likelihood that this election will not be close. I don't anticipate that the system will fail. I'd like to go back, however, to something that Robert said about the role of the Electoral College in close elections. Robert pointed to the 1960 election and argued that if we didn't have the Electoral College, that we might still not know who won that election. That election was won by 100,000 votes at a national level. In 2000, we had at least 2 states, Florida and New Mexico, where the count was fewer than 1,000 votes, which differentiated Bush and Gore. If we had a national popular vote instead of relying on the Electoral College, the likelihood of a recount would be much smaller. I grant Robert's point that a national recount would be a pretty nasty thing, but it's important to remember that with one election rather than 51, the likelihood of that recount drops dramatically.
Okay, Robert Hardaway, I mean, the workings of the Electoral College have indeed come under scrutiny, certainly over the last 2 elections. Is there a genuine need for electoral reform?
Not in the Electoral College area. I think we need a lot of reforms in other areas. Going to paper ballots is a positive trend that many states are going to, so that there's a way to verify how people voted. But in terms of the Electoral College, it was originally set up as a kind of parallel parliament and works very much like parliaments in, say, Great Britain, where in 1974, for example, Labour lost the popular vote but won more delegates into the parliament and therefore selected the government. So the idea of the Founding Fathers was to have a parallel Congress, but the only duty of it would be to elect the president, and so that they maintain the separation of powers. So it's worked very well for us. Once every 100 years or so, you have to have a recount like you did in Florida, but it's so much better. And also the Congressional Quarterly, by the way, gave Nixon the majority of the popular votes because in the state of Alabama, the press allocated the votes for a Democrat other than John Kennedy to John Kennedy, which the Congressional Quarterly has never understood. So according to the Congressional Quarterly's count, Nixon won by a handful of popular votes. That's why I say today we would have no idea who won that election. But we've just been very lucky having an electoral college that ensures that support for a president is broad as well as deep. You can't just have a huge number of popular votes in one region of the country and be opposed in another part of the country. It ensures that support is broad as well as deep.
Let's just get a quick thought from Larry Nordham there in New York before we go to a break. Larry Nordham, if we do get this very high voter turnout that all the experts say we're going to get, how could that actually impact on the voting? And what are the problems on the ground then if so many people turn out to vote?
Well, one of the big ones is something that we saw in 2004 in Ohio, where election officials just weren't prepared for the large number of voters, and what happened is in certain precincts, in certain polling places, you had really long lines, people waiting 3, 4, 5 hours to go to vote, just because there weren't enough machines and there wasn't some alternative means like a paper ballot for people to vote on. I'm definitely concerned about that kind of a problem. Most people can't wait 4 or 5 hours to vote. Most people have to go to work. Most people don't get off the day from work in the United States on Election Day, so that could certainly be a problem.
OK, gentlemen, stay with us, won't you? Because it's time for a short break now. But when we come back, we assess the impact of negative campaigning and ugly tactics on the US election trail. Stay with us.